I didn't know that freedom and loneliness could walk through the same door. The day I aged out of the foster care system, it was raining. That November morning in Houston, when I walked down the steps of the Riverside Drive office, I had a black plastic garbage bag in my hand, 3 pairs of clothes, a cracked screen phone, $47 in cash, and a paper with the address of a shelter that had a 60-day waitlist. The caseworker who handed me my discharge papers shook my hand like she was completing a transaction. She smiled. It was the kind of smile people give when they want to feel like they did enough. I was 18 years and 4 days old. I stood on that sidewalk for a long time. The rain wasn't heavy. It was that thin, cold Houston drizzle that gets into everything, that soaks through your jacket before you even realize it's happening. I didn't have an umbrella. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a single person in the world whose number I could call and say, "Hey, I need help. Can you come?" That's the part nobody tells you about agging out of the system. It's not dramatic. There's no big scene. There's no shouting or crying or door slamming. It's just Tuesday. And then it's Wednesday, and you're standing on a wet sidewalk in a city of 2 million people, and you are completely, utterly alone. My name is Diego Reyes. I was born in San Antonio to a mother who loved me in the only broken ways she knew how, and a father whose face I only know from one photograph that got lost somewhere between my 3rd and 4th foster home. I entered the system at 9 years old. I spent the next 9 years being moved from house to house, county to county, school to school. I learned early that attachment was a liability. I learned to keep my feelings packed light, the same way I kept my bag packed light, because you never knew when someone would knock on a door and tell you it was time to go. And somewhere in all of that moving, in all of that surviving, I was also learning something else about myself. Something I didn't have words for at first. Something I felt in the way I looked at certain boys in gym class, in the way my stomach did something strange when the boy in my 7th grade English class laughed at something I said. I didn't call it anything for a long time. In the houses I grew up in, there was no language for it that wasn't also an insult. By the time I was 15, I knew exactly what I was. I was gay, and I was terrified. Not because I was ashamed of it, not exactly, but because I already understood, with the cold mathematical clarity of a kid who has survived by reading rooms and reading people, that this information was dangerous. In the foster system, you don't get to be complicated. You don't get to be anything other than grateful and quiet and small. I had seen what happened to kids who were too much of anything. They got moved, they got labeled, they got lost. So I kept it quiet. I kept everything quiet. I got decent grades because I understood that grades were currency. I stayed out of trouble because trouble was expensive. I made myself useful and invisible and easy, and I counted down the days until I was 18 and the system's clock ran out. What I didn't plan for was what came after the clock. The shelter on Navigation Boulevard smelled like industrial cleaner, and something underneath it that the cleaner couldn't quite reach. I got there on that first rainy Tuesday and put my name on the wait list. The woman at the front desk, a heavyset Tajana with reading glasses on a beaded chain, looked at me over the tops of her lenses. "You got ID?" "Yes, ma'am." "You got family in the area?" "No, ma'am." She wrote something down. 60-day waitlist, Mijo. You got somewhere to stay in the meantime. I told her I'd figure something out. She gave me a look that said she had heard that before, and she handed me a folded paper with a list of resources: food pantries, day shelters, a church on Harrisburg that did hot meals on Wednesdays and Saturdays. I walked back out into the drizzle with that paper, and I stood on the sidewalk and I read it 3 times. Then I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I started walking. I want to tell you that those first few weeks were hard in a way that built character, in a way that made me stronger, in a way that had a clean narrative arc. But the truth is that they were mostly just cold and boring, and exhausting in a way that ground you down so slowly you almost didn't notice. Survival is not cinematic. It's standing outside a McDonald's on Telephone Road at 6 in the morning, because they open at 6 and it's warm inside. It's knowing which gas stations have bathrooms you can use without buying something. It's learning the bus routes not because you're going somewhere, but because the bus is heated, and the driver doesn't look at you too hard if you stay quiet. I slept in the bus station for the first 4 nights. Then a security guard who had probably seen 1,000 versions of me told me I had to leave. I found a spot under the overpass on 59 where a few other people had set up. I didn't talk much. I watched. I learned the rhythms of that small, unofficial community, who was safe, who wasn't, when to be there, when to disappear. One of the people under that overpass was a man named Carl. He was maybe 50, with a grey beard and a Houston Astros cap that he wore in all weather. Carl didn't ask me questions, he just made space. The first night I showed up with my garbage bag, he moved his things over a few feet without a word, creating a kind of boundary that said, "This part is yours." I didn't know how much that gesture meant until later. When you have nothing, someone making space for you is an enormous act of grace. Carl brought me to the church on Harrisburg the first Wednesday. I sat at a long folding table and ate chicken and rice and canned green beans, and the woman who served me called me baby and meant it, and I had to look down at my tray because something in my chest was doing something I didn't want it to do in public. That church was where I first heard about the Montrose Center. Someone at the meal mentioned it, a younger person, maybe 22, with short hair and paint-stained fingers. They were talking to someone else, but I was listening the way I had learned to listen, quietly, appearing not to. The Montrose Center has a youth program, they were saying, like specifically for LGBTQ kids, housing referrals, counseling, job stuff. I kept eating my green beans, but I memorized the name. It took me 4 days to go, not because I didn't need help, I desperately needed help, but because walking into a place that required you to name yourself felt like standing at the edge of something with no guaranteed landing. I had spent years not naming myself, I had spent years being careful, and now I was supposed to walk into a building and say, here is who I am. And I need something. That's a harder sentence than it sounds when you've been taught that who you are is a liability. I went on a Friday morning. The Montrose Center was on Valentine Street in the heart of the Houston neighborhood, in a building that looked ordinary from the outside but felt different the moment you stepped in. There were people in the lobby who looked like me, young, uncertain, carrying things. There was a bulletin board covered in flyers and resource sheets and a small pride flag pinned in the corner. There was a woman at the front desk with a warm face who said, "Hey, welcome in. Can I help you?" And I stood there and I opened my mouth, and for a moment nothing came out. She waited. She didn't fill the silence with impatience or with pity. She just waited. "I'm 18, I said finally. I just aged out of foster care. I don't have anywhere to go." She nodded. "Okay, you came to the right place. What's your name?" "It's Diego." "I'm Sandra. Can I get you some water, Diego? And then let's sit down and figure out what you need." I don't know why that was the thing that broke me. Maybe it was the water. Maybe it was the way she said figure out what you need, like it was a solvable problem, like I was a person worth solving for. Maybe it was just that I had been carrying everything alone for so long that the first moment of directed, patient kindness split something open. I sat down in the chair across from her desk and I cried for about 2 minutes. She handed me a box of tissues and didn't make a thing of it. When I was done, she handed me a cup of water and said, "Okay, let's start." What followed was not a miracle. It was paperwork and phone calls and waitlists and bureaucracy, and a lot of sitting in plastic chairs. The Montrose Center connected me with a transitional housing program for LGBTQ youth, a small house in the 3rd Ward where 6 young people shared bedrooms and chores, and a set of house rules that were firm but fair. I was on a wait list for that too. But while I waited, Sandra connected me with emergency rental assistance that paid for 2 weeks in a budget motel on the Southwest Freeway. That motel room was the most privacy I had experienced in months. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed that first night and just existing, just being in a room that locked. I took a shower that lasted 40 minutes. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed and stared at the wall and breathed. It sounds like nothing, it was everything. During those 2 weeks, I went to the Montrose Center every day. Sandra connected me with a case manager named Tomás, a compact, soft-spoken Mexican-American man in his 30s who wore neat button-down shirts and spoke to me like I was an intelligent adult, which was not something I had always experienced in the system. Tomás helped me apply for food stamps. He helped me get my state ID replaced. It had been lost in one of my moves, and navigating that without an address was the kind of bureaucratic nightmare that swallows people whole. He connected me with a job readiness program. He also, gently but clearly, asked me if I had talked to anyone about what I had been through. I told him I was fine. He looked at me the way people look when they know you are not fine, but also know that pushing will close you up. "Okay," he said, "but we've got counselors here whenever you're ready. No pressure, just want you to know it's there." I said okay. I didn't think I would use it. I used it, but that came later. I moved into the transitional house in the 3rd Ward in January, 6 weeks after I aged out. It was a narrow 2-story house on Homan Street with a patchy front yard and a porch swing that squeaked. I shared a room with a 20-year-old named Marcus, a lanky black gay man from Beaumont who talked in his sleep and had an opinion about everything and made me laugh harder than I had laughed in years. Marcus was the first gay friend I ever had. Not just an acquaintance, not someone I observed from a distance, an actual friend. Someone who knew what I was and didn't make it a thing. He talked about being gay the way he talked about everything else, directly, without ceremony. He talked about boys he had liked, about the first time he had admitted it to himself, about the church deacon uncle who didn't speak to him anymore. He told these stories while eating cereal on his bed at 11 at night, and the casualness of it was radical to me. The idea that this thing I had protected so carefully could just be talked about, like anything else. I started talking too, slowly, a sentence at a time. The house had a structure that I think saved me in ways I'm still understanding. House meetings on Sundays, chore rotations, curfews that were strict but logical. A house manager named Keisha who ran a tight ship and had exactly zero tolerance for drama, but also when you needed something real, was there in a way that was solid and true. Keisha was a black lesbian woman in her 40s who had been in the system herself 30 years ago. She never made a speech about it. She didn't need to. You could feel it in the way she moved through the house, with a kind of authority that came not from power but from having survived. I got a job in February, a coffee shop on Westthamer in the heart of Montrose. It paid $10 an hour and I worked 5 shifts a week, and I was so tired at the end of each shift that I sometimes fell asleep before I could finish eating. But I had a paycheck, my first real paycheck. I remember looking at that direct deposit notification on my phone, $387.42, and feeling something I didn't quite have a word for, not happiness exactly. Something more solid than happiness, something that felt like ground under my feet. I also started seeing a counselor at the Montrose Center. Her name was Dr. Anita Flores, a warm, direct Chicana woman who had a small cactus on her desk and a way of asking questions that made you think you were arriving at the answer yourself. I went every Thursday at 4 o'clock. At first I talked about practical things, work, the house, my case plan. Then slowly, over weeks, I started talking about other things. The moves, the houses where I had been invisible. The houses where I hadn't been safe. The years of keeping myself so packed light and so quiet that I had almost forgotten what I actually wanted, what I actually felt, what I actually was when no one needed me to be anything in particular. One Thursday in March, she asked me about my mother. I hadn't talked about her. I had filed her away in a part of myself that I didn't open, the same way you close a room in a house and stop thinking about what's inside. She loved me, I said, she just couldn't. Dr. Flores nodded. What couldn't she do? I thought about it for a long time. She couldn't be stable, she couldn't be safe, she couldn't, I stopped. She couldn't be a mother, not the way I needed. And what did you need? I opened my mouth, nothing came out for a moment. Then, someone to stay. It was the simplest thing I had ever said. And it cracked me open in the middle of a Thursday afternoon in a small office on Valentine Street, and Dr. Flores handed me tissues and waited, and I let it crack. Spring in Houston arrived the way it always does, suddenly, violently, all at once. The air went from cold to thick and fragrant overnight, and the city exhaled into color. I started noticing things I hadn't had the capacity to notice before. The bougainvillea climbing the fence at the end of Homan Street, the way the light looked on Sunday mornings through our kitchen window, the particular sound of the Third Ward, music from porches, children, the distant call of someone's name. I was still exhausted. I was still anxious in ways I didn't fully understand yet, but something had shifted. I was starting to take up more space, not aggressively, just more honestly. I started eating more. I started sleeping better. I started having opinions about things that didn't matter, which is, I've learned, a sign that you feel safe enough to care about small things. Marcus introduced me to his friends, a loose, rotating group of young queer people from all over Houston, some in college, some working, some still figuring it out. We gathered on Friday nights, usually at someone's apartment, usually with takeout from somewhere on Bel Air, usually talking until 2 in the morning about everything and nothing. These were people who were gay and trans and bi and non-binary and questioning, people who were black and brown and white and mixed, people from the suburbs and the wards and the valley and places even smaller and further away. I had never belonged anywhere, and here I was belonging. It didn't feel like what I thought belonging would feel like. I had always imagined it as a dramatic moment, a door swinging open, light pouring through, but it was quieter than that. It was Marcus passing me a plate of food without asking. It was a girl named Priya remembering that I didn't like cilantro. It was the Friday night when someone put on a song I loved from childhood, and I started singing along before I realized I was doing it, and nobody looked at me like it was strange, and I kept singing. That was the moment, I think. Not a dramatic threshold, but a Thursday counseling session and a first paycheck and a plate of food handed across a room. That was when I started becoming. By summer I had moved into a small studio apartment in the East End, my own place, my name on the lease, a door that was entirely mine to open and close. It was a 6th-floor walk-up with a window that faced east and a kitchen the size of a hallway. I furnished it slowly, almost reverently. A bed frame from a Facebook marketplace listing. A second-hand couch in a color I can only describe as hopeful blue. A lamp, a rug. A plant that I kept alive, which felt like a genuine accomplishment. I decorated one wall with photographs. Not of family, I didn't have many of those, and the ones I had were complicated. Photos of places I liked, prints I found at a flea market on navigation, a postcard of the Houston skyline that Marcus gave me as a housewarming gift with a note that said, "For the boy who finally landed." I read that note about 6 times. That summer I also met someone. His name was Julian, and he worked at the record shop 2 blocks from the coffee shop where I worked. He was 23, Puerto Rican and white, with dark curly hair and a laugh that arrived before he was ready for it. We talked for 3 months before anything happened, long, wandering conversations that moved from music to our childhoods to the city to things we were afraid of and things we wanted. He knew I had been in foster care. I told him I was gay in a normal sentence, in the middle of a normal conversation, and he said me too, and that was that. The first time he took my hand in public, we were walking down Westthamer on a Saturday evening, the street loud and golden with summer light. I had a strange feeling move through me. Not fear exactly, though it had that quality. More like the anticipation of fear that never actually arrived. I kept waiting for something bad to happen, for someone to say something, for the other shoe to drop. And then a block passed, and then 2, and nothing happened except that his hand was warm, and the street smelled like jasmine from somewhere, and the sun was going down over Houston in that enormous Texas way, painting everything orange and pink. I had survived so many things by shrinking, and here I was, walking down a public street, holding someone's hand, taking up the exact amount of space I was supposed to take. It sounds so small, it was the biggest thing. Julian and I dated for about 7 months. It didn't last, not because it was bad, but because we were both still becoming, and the people we were becoming were heading in slightly different directions. When it ended, it was sad and clean, the way endings can sometimes be when 2 people handle each other with care. We stayed friends, we still text sometimes. He was my first real relationship, and what he gave me beyond the relationship itself was the knowledge that I was capable of it. That I could be known and still be wanted. That I could let someone close without it destroying me. That knowledge was worth more than I can say. In September, I enrolled in community college. San Jacinto College, East Campus. I didn't have a plan, not a specific one. I took English composition and introduction to psychology and a history class about the American Southwest that I loved completely and unexpectedly. I rode the bus to campus 3 mornings a week and sat in classrooms with people who didn't know anything about me, and I could feel myself expanding into the anonymity of it. Here I was just a student. A person with a notebook and a backpack and an opinion about the reading. My English professor was a tall white woman named Dr. Patterson who had a dry wit and extremely high standards. The first essay I turned in came back with more red ink than I had ever seen, and a note at the bottom that said, "Your ideas are strong, your voice is real, now learn to trust it on the page." I read that note the same number of times I read Marcus's postcard. I started writing, not for class, just writing. In a cheap journal I bought at a drugstore. At first it was scattered, inarticulate, more feeling than thought, but I kept going. I wrote about the system. I wrote about the shelter and the overpass and the motel room with the 40-minute shower. I wrote about Carl and his Astros cap. I wrote about Sandra saying figure out what you need like I was a person worth solving for. I wrote about Marcus and the Friday nights and Julian, and the walk down Westthamer and the plant I was keeping alive on my east-facing windowsill. I wrote about my mother. That was the hardest, but I wrote about her. Not to make peace with everything, I don't think peace is always the right word. Some things you don't make peace with, you just learn to carry differently. But I wrote about her because she was part of the story and the story was mine, and I was learning, slowly, imperfectly, 1 sentence at a time, that my story was worth telling, that my life had weight and meaning and texture. That the things I had survived were not things to be ashamed of or hidden, but things that had built something real in me, something I was only beginning to name. I'm 22 now, I'm still in Houston. I'm still at San Jacinto, working toward a degree in social work, which surprises nobody who has spent any time with me and also surprises me completely every time I think about it. I work at the Montrose Center now, not as a caseworker yet, I'm not licensed, but as a youth outreach assistant. I sit across from kids who are where I was, 18, scared, holding their whole lives in a garbage bag. I hand them water and I wait while they figure out how to begin. I tell them, you came to the right place. I mean it every time. My apartment has more plants now, 4, all alive, which I consider genuine miracle and a character arc. The hopeful blue cooch is starting to fade in the right places. Marcus and I still talk every week. He's in Dallas now, doing well, still talking in his sleep if his roommate is to be believed. Dr. Flores and I finished our regular sessions last year, though I know I can go back whenever I need to. Keisha sent me a card when I got the job at the Montrose Center. It just said, "You did good, baby, keep going." I keep it on my refrigerator. I think about Carl sometimes. I went back to that overpass once, about a year after I left, and he wasn't there. I don't know what happened to him, and I don't know how to find him, and that sits with me. He moved over a few feet in the rain and made space for a scared teenager he didn't know, and I never got to tell him what that meant. I hope he's somewhere warm. I hope someone made space for him too. I am not who I thought I would become, which is to say I did not become anyone's tragedy. I did not become a statistic, though I was so close to becoming one that I can still feel the edge of it. I became a person with plants and a fadding cooch and a job I believe in and the ability to sit with young people in plastic chairs and say, without flinching, "I see you. You are not invisible, you are not too much, you are not a problem to be managed. You are a person who deserves to take up exactly as much space as you need." I know what it costs to say that and mean it. I know what it cost me to learn it. $47 and a cracked phone and a rainy Tuesday and the long, slow work of becoming someone who doesn't flinch at his own reflection. The foster care system failed me in ways that are real and documented and that I will spend part of my career trying to fix. But I also met Sandra. I met Tamaz. I met Keisha and Marcus and Dr. Flores and Julian. I met Carl, who moved 3 feet to the left without being asked. And somewhere in all of that, I met myself. That's the part I didn't expect, that after all the years of keeping myself packed light and quiet and small, there was still something waiting inside me that hadn't given up, something stubborn and inconvenient and alive, something that walked down a wet sidewalk with $47 and a garbage bag and somehow, improbably, decided that this was not the end. It was just Tuesday. And then it was Wednesday.